Okay, so slow start, but really a rollicking Q&A. So thanks everyone for joining. I get a lot of questions. My name's Andrew Kirsch. I spent just under a decade as an intelligence officer with CSIS. Many of you know me. If you're here, you probably do. And I get a lot of questions about what it was like to work for CSIS. And one of those questions is about being an analyst. And being an analyst is a very different role than being an intelligence officer. And I thought, who better to answer that question than two of the finest, both with CSIS, CSE, and the RCMP. So I've invited some colleagues with me today to answer some of those questions about what it means to be a national security analyst. And maybe I'll let them introduce themselves, maybe talk a little about their career and path as analysts in national security. And Angus, you're here. We know your microphone is working. Can I turn it over to you to maybe introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much, Andrew. So my name is Angus Smith. I'm very happy to be here today with you all. I was an analyst with an intelligence analyst with the strategic intelligence analyst with the RCMP for about 33 years. And my career took me from kind of the dying days of the Cold War through the war on drugs, as it was known in the early 90s, the next great kind of moral crisis. And after that, I spent a lot of time working on Russian organized crime, specifically Eastern European organized crime and corruption. And then after 9/11, I spent I suppose the last third of my career working in national security and counterterrorism. So that kind of covered the waterfront, I think, in terms of what we were dealing with in those days. So,
do we have Phil? Did Phil join us, or is he still having some? He might still be having some technical issues. So we'll Angus, we'll ask you our next question, which is
Sure.
how'd you get your start? How did you actually end up being an RCMP strategic analyst? Because I know a lot of folks, as I said, get in touch, want to know where do I start? How do I start? How do I get in?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit harder for me to answer. I was in graduate school, and I was probably the most least likely to have anything to do with the RCMP or the intelligence community or policing or anything like that. I was a kind of a raving Marxist, through most of my youth. But I was at one of those job fairs or recruitment fairs that they often have at universities, and I went to a few and sort of various government agencies and NGOs and so on, and it just none of it was really working for me. And I got into a conversation with someone who was there from the RCMP, and we kind of clicked. It was very interesting, and I got a call back. And they said, we'd like you to come to Ottawa. We'd like to talk to you a little bit more. And so off I went to Ottawa. And what was happening was that you guys, CSIS, had just separated from the RCMP. And the RCMP, which is often, a little bit slow moving, kind of woke up one day and realized that in the process, they'd lost their entire intelligence capability. And so they were sort of they realized that they needed to rebuild it. And I actually started working in the library at the RCMP, but I was essentially working as a strategic analyst on sort of various special projects and helping operational units and administrative units with things. So, and as I say, it was the dying days of the Cold War. It was very, very interesting times. And I think the fact that I had some background in Russia and Eastern Europe really helped. So, but it was purely accidental.
It's right place, right time. And then I think the lesson I tell everybody is, hardest part is getting in. And then once you're in, you start in the library, you can work your way up, and I think the cream rises. They find people who do good work. Those folks get more work and get a better tasking. I see Phil has joined us. You made it in, Phil. A man probably needs no introduction, but maybe I'll let him quickly introduce himself. And Phil, so a little about you and your career, and then also I will unmute you, which I can't because you can unmute yourself, I think. You're unable to unmute yourself. I mean,
Hmm.
Phil, we've gone beyond the realm of my technical abilities. Otis, if you can figure out a way to unmute Phil, that would be greatly appreciated. Phil, when we get to you, we're gonna ask you about your career, how you got in, what your and a little bit more about advice on how to get in. Okay, so Angus, you're in there.
Yeah.
What's
There
the
I
role?
was.
What's the role of an intelligence analyst at the RCMP? Like, what are you actually doing on a day-to-day basis? If you could say what you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I mean, I retired in 2018, so I think things have probably changed somewhat since that time. But at the same time, things don't really change a whole lot. But so I was a strategic analyst, and so what that meant is that I was kind of spent a lot of my time on, not specifically on higher level stuff, but I spent a lot of my time looking at kind of what was going on in the wider world, sort of politically, economically, culturally, historically, socially, all of those kinds of things, and trying to draw it together into a coherent whole so that we could identify, potential threats to Canada, to the mission of the RCMP, to the safety and well-being of Canadian communities, to the safety and well-being of RCMP members, Canadian police officers, and so on. And so tactical analysis, which I never really worked in, is somewhat different, because usually tactical analysts are embedded or connected or linked to specific operational or investigative teams, and so they're kind of working a little bit more at the coal face, and they're not so much concerned with long-term trends. They're very much concerned with the here and now, sort of identifying key players, the links between key players, and sort of who's kind of doing what to whom in any given investigation. So that's probably a sort of a layman's description of the difference between tactical and strategic analysis. And in a given day, I mean, sort of certainly towards the end of my career, I was usually briefing, at least 2 or 3 times a week, briefing either senior executives of the RCMP, senior executives in the intelligence community, the Privy Council office, which serves cabinet. And I was doing I did a lot of sort of specialty projects on emerging issues. So, one of the things we were looking at was the beginning of the Brexit, the whole Brexit movement, and what that could really mean for Canada, and what it could mean for police and intelligence relationships, because a lot of our relationships with the UK were predicated on relationships with the European Union as well. I did stuff on kidnapping, on hostage taking, on the emergence of the right wing, and I did a lot of teaching. I taught at the Canadian Police College. Did some teaching, university teaching, sort of as guest lecturers. I taught at the FBI Academy. I taught at the Marine Corps Academy, and so on. So there was a lot of back and forth in that regard. And that was actually, the teaching was one of the most rewarding parts of my career. So
I want to ask you a question, because you touched on it briefly about the difference between a tactical analyst and a strategic analyst.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to identify that early in your career, which path you want to go down? And like, if you need to have a specialty in an area to be a tactical analyst, or is there, if you're saying I want to be an analyst, but I don't know if I want to be tactical or strategic, or how do I move between the two? Is that something you have to consider before you start, or is it like a major when you go to college, or how does that, like, because you have to be a specialist when you say I know Russian, or Phil, who has joined us, and we're going to talk to him as well, like, and maybe you can chime in on this, but I'm kind of curious, because in my experience, folks with specific skills, language capabilities, knowledge of organizations kind of end up tactical analysts because they have that, they build up that awareness and knowledge. But they also require that on the strategic side too, because you want to have people who are familiar with the milieu. So how do you go down that route? Can you change? Is there a difference? Do you need to know? If I can ask.
I would say, And Phil, Phil, you just got in, so I know you're
chomping at the bit.
Yeah, so I would say that, you know, looking at it purely from a policing perspective, the RCMP is an organization that plays many roles and still does have a significant role in the Canadian intelligence community. And so if you're interested in sort of the RCMP, or if you're interested in strategic intelligence in a policing context, the RCMP, or one of the big three, there's the RCMP, there's the OPP, and there's the QPF. They're probably your best bet, because they really use a lot of strategic intelligence, because they're always looking out into that sort of much broader world. But you know, smaller police forces, which is to say, you know, TPS, Toronto Police Service, Vancouver, I mean, they're not, obviously not small police forces, but sort of urban police forces, local police forces tend to rely primarily on strategic analysts, and they get a lot of on tactical analysis.
Yeah.
They get a lot of the strategic analysis they need from RCMP and from CSIS, from you guys. So yeah.
Okay. So Phil, questions to you. How did you start? How did you get into the career? Maybe a little bit of your path, and mostly, as I said, to the folks interested in that career, what drew you to it, and how did you get through it?
Sure. So I apologize for the delay. There seemed to be a technical issue. Much like Angus, dumb luck. I was born and raised in London, Ontario, did all my schooling, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary, went to Western, or as I called it, University of Western Ontario back then. They changed at some point without asking my permission, I might add. I was finishing up a master's degree in, of all things, Spanish in the early 80s, and looking for a job during an early 80s recession. And as an arts graduate, the chances were, as Angus will remember, next to nil. There weren't a lot of people knocking at my door trying to hire me, and I saw an advertisement in the placement office that said the Department of National Defense wants linguists. Well, I was a linguist. I was fluent in English, French, and Spanish, 2 years of Russian, 2 years of German, a bit of Dutch, even a bit of Inuktitut, if you can believe it, and applied. And long story short, got an interview in Ottawa after my security clearance, and showed up at this building, which I thought was National Defense, and was subsequently informed by a very burly ex-RCMP man who filled the room, saying, actually, son, we're not National Defense, we're Communications Security Establishment, CSE, and here's what we do. And at this point, I'm thinking, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into?
They didn't even tell you before you got there what you were applying to?
They couldn't, because I didn't have the indoctrination to a TSSI clearance. And they said, they said, here's what we do, signals intelligence, and we've hired you. And by the way, if you disclose where you work, it's 14 years in jail. I'm 22 years old, thinking, what have I done? And so for the first part of my career, Andrew, I was actually a foreign intelligence analyst. I worked in 10 different languages. I ended up acquiring Arabic and Farsi very quickly after, because I have a penchant for languages.
Sure,
so
clearly.
I was a foreign intelligence analyst for my time at CSE. And then at the end of 2000, decided it was time for a change. And I'd already worked with CSIS very closely on a bunch of files, what we call Section 16 files, which is CSIS foreign intelligence mandate, as you're well aware. And got to CSIS in January of 2001, and 9 months later, much like Angus, 9/11 happened. And because of my Arabic and my knowledge of Iran and Middle Eastern history and culture, I morphed very quickly into a counterterrorism analyst. And I became the service's chief person on Islamist extremism in Canada and abroad for the next 15 years. But looking back, if you'd asked me when I was growing up in London, would I work in intelligence, I would have asked, how many heads do you have? Because I had no idea these organizations existed. When I started at CSE, CSIS wasn't even an entity. It was still the RCMP Security Service. And so a lot of just in the right place at the right time. And much like Angus, and Angus and I worked together very closely for many years when he was at the RCMP. And we finished our careers together at Public Safety Canada in the National Security Directorate. And Angus has been a dear friend of mine for a very long time. We just ended up having a job that most Canadians would, we had a job where we couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. It was that interesting and that exciting and that important. And so I count myself as a very lucky Canadian.
So what was that, if I can ask, and whatever you can tell, we have kind of three different agencies here, RCMP,
Yeah.
CSIS, and CSE.
Mhm.
The differences, can you tell the differences between, because people think CSIS, no, fewer people have heard of CSE. I get a
Yeah.
lot of CSIS and I say, well, have you thought about
Yeah.
RCMP, CBSA, all these places that have analysts and have participate in intelligence, the national security community? What is now the CSE, like being an analyst at CSE for foreign intelligence versus being an analyst at CSIS with obviously our domestic intelligence service?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think one poll I saw, Andrew, that 3% of Canadians have ever heard of CSE. So it's a very, very low number. In
How
fact,
many?
3%.
No, it's
Yeah.
no one has
I guess.
heard of CSE.
In fact, people call it the Canadian Security Establishment. They don't even know what it stands for communications. Now, look at this is a Cold War organization. It came out of the Second World War. Much like Angus, I began my career during the Cold War. What we didn't know then was the end of the Cold War. We thought we were still in the middle of it in the early 80s. And CSE morphed from an organization that collected Soviet signals during the 50s, 60s, and 70s into a foreign intelligence organization once the wall fell and the USSR dissolved. So that was CSE's mandate. Of course, it also had the protecting of communications mandate, what we called IT back then, infrastructure. I forget what it stood for, information technology. And of course, now CSE is the home of the Cyber Command that tries to protect Canada from cyber attacks. I think what's changed, Andrew, over since I've been there, and as I say to people, the CSA I worked for is a very different organization than what it is today.
Sure.
After 9/11, CSE got into counterterrorism. We didn't do counterterrorism when I was at CSE. We were strictly foreign intelligence. And they stood up the counterterrorism command. They have a watch office. They have a 24-hour operation. So it's very much morphed into a lot of different areas, I think, since 9/11. Not to mention foreign interference, cyber challenges, hacking, all that kind of stuff. Whereas the service, as you're well aware, we have our mandate through the CSIS Act. We look at four major things: foreign espionage, foreign interference, counterterrorism, and subversion. That defines what CSIS does from its investigative perspective. And of course, the RCMP has its own mandate, which is largely criminal, but also goes into national security. I think I get the same questions as you do. I want to be an analyst in intelligence. Where do I go?
Where do I go?
What
do I do?
Well, there's all kinds of options. There's a big three, as you've mentioned. There's also Canada Border Services. There's also Canada Revenue. There's National Defense.
Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada has a very robust intelligence shop.
Exactly. I think what the Canadian government needs, and what Angus and I and yourself have been trying to do since our so-called retirement, is to encourage people that want to, fight for Team Canada to bring their skills to the table. And I'll reflect also on the whole tactical versus strategic thing you asked Angus earlier. Yeah. To me, it's a matter of experience and knowledge. I could not have begun my career as a strategic analyst in anything back in 1983. I simply didn't have the background for it. I was good at languages, but I didn't know, Iranian foreign policy or, Russian military plans kind of thing. So I think that most people would probably begin as a tactical analyst. And then as you became more mature, exposed to more files and your knowledge gained, you would go into that strategic role. Now, we did have instances at the service where we brought in academics who spent their lives looking at certain things, and they immediately became strategic analysts because they had the background already. They had to learn the intelligence background. And you don't write academic papers when you work for CSIS or RCMP. You write very short things that customers can understand. But having that background as a political scientist, international relations specialist, whatever, would afford you, I think, a good opportunity to become a strat analyst right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Phil, I'm going to ask you a question, but you might find this funny. But when I was on my desk at HQ, I had to send a note over to CSEC at the time, right? And so I found an old memo template, and I shot this. Phil did my memo, and I sent my memo over. And it wasn't until a few memos later that I realized I'd been writing to the Canadian Security Establishment of Canada, and I thought that can't be right. We can't. I know we've got some silly names, but we can't have Canada twice in the title. Yeah. And so then of course I looked and I saw, well, this is the template that I got, and I thought, how many emails? And no one noticed in the 2 years that I was there, and how many memos have gone to the Canadian Security Establishment of Canada from CSIS?
Fun fact, Andrew. It used to be called the Examinations Unit during the Second World War. Then it morphed into the Communications Branch of the National Research Council. That's how they hid it, basically, within the budget. And my first desk had a little tag saying CBNRC, believe it or not. It became CSE in 75. And then some genius decided, we got to put Canada somewhere in the name. So they called it CSEC. Well, they dropped the C several years ago, the second C. It's gone back to Communications Security Establishment, which doesn't really mean anything. Now, interestingly, the Australians, part of the Five Eyes, their equivalent was called DSD, Defense Signals Directorate, which again meant nothing. And they've changed it now to ASD, the Australian Signals Directorate. So you kind of get, it's Australia, it's signals, what they're doing. Communications Security Establishment gives you no insight as to what CSE is.
Unless you're an insider, I mean, nobody knows what signals means either.
No, that's so Angus, I want to ask you a question of the RCMP because it's what I'm least familiar with. And you obviously, I guess, are you're a civilian analyst. You don't have to go through depot. You don't have to become a police officer. What do you do to prepare to be an RCMP analyst? Is there a degree or the usual requirements to get the role? Do you have to have an area of expertise that you're already thinking about when you go in, a language skill? Because I imagine you're pulled out, whatever file or they need bodies. If it's like CSIS, but we have our mandate. We have our mandate that says these are the four things. Yeah. How does it work over there, where it could be something's come up and we need you?
It's interesting. We have I remember sitting in a conversation with he had been the director of the Intelligence Advisory Secretariat at Privy Council, Greg Fife. Do you remember Greg Fife?
Oh yeah, Greg. Yeah, he's still around. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember having a conversation, having a coffee with Greg or something like that, and he said, we get all these people who come to us and they've got degrees or they've got majors or minors in kind of intelligence studies, right? And there are various Canadian universities that teach intelligence studies. It's like a cottage industry in U.S. universities, and he says the problem is, so they come, and they end up, applying to PCO, and they have various qualifications, so we hire them, and I know this is going on elsewhere in the intelligence community. And he said, but the problem is we don't really know what to do with them because they know a whole lot about sort of all of this theoretical stuff about intelligence and how intelligence should work, but they're not coming with any sort of substantial subject matter knowledge of any kind, and nor do many of them have, and because they've been so socialized, many of them don't have the kind of the broad fund of general knowledge, I guess, that we really need in people who are going to be good intelligence analysts or good intelligence officers, or whatever you want to call them. And that really struck me, and because I realized, looking back over a career, that many of the best people that I worked with, including Phil, because as Phil, including Phil, because Phil and I worked very, very closely together. Actually, CSIS and the RCMP used to, I swear, they used to deliberately send us out together, like all over the world, because the fact that we actually got along actually led people to believe that the RCMP and
That's right.
That's right. We were the Mutt and Jeff show that they sent out.
We were the Mutt and Jeff show. But anyway, I digress wildly. But and I realized that often the best people that I worked with were generalists, and they usually had a background in the humanities, and but not even necessarily, but had a really sort of abiding interest in history, culture, and all of that kind of stuff, And I mean, I guess looking back on myself, I grew up in Southeast Asia in the 60s. I grew up in Thailand and the Philippines, and so I sort of, even as a little kid, had a front seat to the Vietnam War. And growing up, I always knew that there was like something going on, right? And that the adults really didn't want to talk to me about. So I was always trying to sort of figure it out. And it was I think that's when I looking back, I think that's what kind of made me into an intelligence analyst in a way. It was that experience.
If I can echo Angus's comments, I completely agree with him that this intelligence studies, it's fascinating. It's gained a lot of I think momentum over the past decade. It is a cottage industry. I would agree with Angus on that. I wouldn't call it useless, but I agree with Angus that from my perspective, what makes a really good intelligence analyst are a number of factors. First of all, there's an innate desire to learn. There's an innate curiosity. Like I said, I grew up in London, Ontario. I was good at languages. I couldn't find Iran on a map, when I was growing up, but I became an Iranian specialist. But what I did is exactly what Angus said. I went and I read Iranian history and Iranian culture. I learned the language. I learned everything about the recent the developments since the Iranian Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing I think that makes a really good analyst, you have to really love to write and be a very good writer. And most importantly, in the intelligence business, you have to be able to write succinctly, because as I say to people, no one reads 40-page reports written by intelligence agencies. They'll read a page or a page and a half. And if you can't summarize what you know in a page and a half, and in a way that strikes the reader as the bottom line up front, here's what we need to know, you failed at your job. The third most important factor is the ability to say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse than an intelligence analyst that thinks that they know everything, because that's a hubris. And we certainly have seen that historically. In fact, we may be seeing it right now, what's happening in Iran with, the intelligence assessments on whether Iran did or did not have the capability. There's a humility, I think, to being an analyst. And, I agree with Angus that you can be a generalist in many different things. You can only really specialize in a very, very few number of things. And what you need to do is say, that's not my area of specialization. Now, I've done a lot of media since I retired from the service 10 years ago. And I'll often, in fact, I got a call yesterday from say, can you come and talk about this? I looked at the topic. I said, no, I can't. Well, why not? I know nothing about it. I can pretend, right? I can go on your show and say something that sounds mildly intelligent, but I would be deceiving you. That's not my file. And I find, going back to the whole intelligence programs that Angus talked about, a lot of people will purport to be national security specialists, but really aren't. Because and the problem is that national security expert is largely undefined. It's self-defined. I'm a national security expert. What does that mean? Do you have a degree in national security expertise? Because I've never seen one in Canada. Mm-hmm. So I think that you got to be honest with people about what you know and what you don't know.
I know some folks will take exception in our chat about whether the usefulness or uselessness of degrees, and look, I think my view has always been, the one requirement to be an intelligence officer, one of the few requirements to be an intelligence officer, is a degree. They don't care which degree you have, but the degree has been a benchmark to demonstrate kind of a skills and a competence in some of the, the analytic rigor and be able to write reports. And I agree, can be very, very useful. My view has always been there are other ways to demonstrate competence, and sometimes where we limit ourselves to say someone needs a degree. Folks who leave school and go to join the military or have real world experience. I'll give an example. I can't say his name, but the best intelligence officer I ever worked with took 4 times to get into CSIS. He applied 4 times. And the best IO I ever worked with. And one of the reasons why is because that determination that he wanted to do it and he was willing to apply again and again and again is what made him a great IO. He was great at knocking on doors and his persistence as well as that congeniality.
Andrew, let me tell you a quick story about degrees. So when I was at CSE, before I joined the service, I was actually the head of collection. And a lot of the guys that worked for me were military. They worked for, what was called the Canadian Forces Supplementary Radio System, CFSRS. These guys were experts at signals. They knew every signal in the known universe, and they were able to, demodulate it and get the intelligence out. And they would have their 20-year career in the military, want to join CSE. And I'd say, I'd hire you in a heartbeat. Yeah. And I was told by his personnel, they don't have a degree.
Yes.
I said, I know that. I know they've got high school. That's why they joined the military. But this guy knows every signal in the universe. And they said, we can't hire them because they don't have it. I said, what parallel universe are you living in? Where I'm going to take a person, with a MA in basket weaving because they have an MA, as opposed to somebody who is a signals expert.
I'm a political science guy. So let's not take shots here.
I said basket weaving, not political science. For the record.
No, I'm saying my degree was anyway, we can talk about my pass-fail career at university. But I want to pick up on a couple of things you said, because one is interesting for me. It might be for others. The role of intelligence officer, I would go out, have coffees when I was a field investigator, write a report and send it up the chain. And I know analysts would look at it, and I assume that, eventually it might become a product and someone else, read it and it factored in. So I'm curious how the analysts fit into the chain in terms of where you get your information from and where it goes to, and then any frustrations in that chain. For me, it was like, I hope someone reads this, and I have no idea if they will. And it was also kind of getting that direction. What exactly are we interested in? So where does the analyst kind of fit in? Maybe Angus and Phil, both of you, into that process, and if there are kind of fun parts of that and challenges to it too.
Sure. Well, I'll start if that's okay, Angus. Yeah. So when I was at the service, the first thing I would do on a daily basis is go into our system, which we used to call BRS. I have no idea what it's called right now.
That's right.
And I would read every report that was in that system that came in the last 24 hours. People like yourself in the regions that had interviewed a source, surveillance report, whatever. I would read it to see what was happening, because my job was to figure out, what does this mean on a national scale to our threat environment? And I mentored a lot of junior strategic analysts saying, if you're not doing this, you're not doing your job. It's not enough to read the Globe and Mail, BBC, SIGINT. If you're not reading what our Canadian sources are telling us, because your primary mandate is to keep Canada safe, you are failing at your job. So it was my job to take what you guys did and then look at it over a period of time and say, okay, what kind of trend can we acknowledge here? What are we seeing happening? And then write something up, 1 or 2 pages, that would go up to senior officials saying, we're worried about X, or we're worried about Y, we're worried about Z, and here's the reason we're worried about it. Oh, and by the way, here's the reliability of our sources. They're confirm reliability or believe reliability or whatever kind of thing. That's what I think an analyst has to do, to work with people on the ground, such as yourself, at the coalface, whether you're intelligence officers, surveillance, whatever you are, tactical analysts in the region. That's the job of an analyst at headquarters.
Yeah. I don't really, I mean, that mirrors, my experience, very much. I mean, intelligence organizations are intelligence organizations, right? So, and I had, very similar morning coffee to Phil, but I think, because I was doing, and I know Phil was also a strategic analyst, and so one of the things I was doing is that I was sort of reading stuff that was coming up from the bottom up, and then I was also trying to sort of square that with all of the stuff that was going on out in the world, right? So, for example, let's look at something that's been on all our minds recently, which is, of course, the what's been going on in Iran over the past few days. So, I'd be paying, if I was working on this, I'd be paying very, very close attention to anything that was coming out of Iranian communities, anything that was coming out of other communities, and really trying to sort of link that to specific events that were happening over in the Middle East, in the region. And trying to, as Phil says, to sort of identify trends, identify possible threats and risks, and so on. So it's always sort of that it's almost like a shell game, sort of you kind of scramble everything around, and then you come out with this nugget. And I think that's very much what intelligence is all about. But I used to tell, people would say to me, well, how to, and not to, I hear what you say about reading the Globe and Mail every day, Phil, but people used to say to me, well, I really want to, be a strategic analyst like you. So what should I do? And I used to say, well, what I really need you to do, I have one requirement, and that's to read a newspaper every day. Right? And they said, well, what newspaper? And I'd say, it doesn't matter, any newspaper, just read it. Well, what should I read? And I'd say, it doesn't matter, just read the newspaper, because, and, even if it's a story about firefighters rescuing a cat from the top of a tree, that gives you social currency. It gives you currency, and that's going to lead you to other things, and it's going to take your mind to other places. And I think that's just so important for intelligence work. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm just a curmudgeon, but I'm afraid that as things become sort of more and more technologized, and God knows what AI is going to do to craft of intelligence analysis, I still think that some of those basics are so important.
And so let me push, like, where does it go? And do you get feedback on where that analysis goes? So you write a piece, you say, this is what I'm seeing, these are the trends, and you have to, it's analysis. You have to say, we get a few a few points, and this is what we think of the relevance to threats to security of Canada. Where does that go? Do you get feedback on that? Do you see what happens with it, or does it disappear like it used to be with my reports?
I used, and I know Phil has this experience as well, and often, we were involved in this, like we were doing stuff jointly. But you get tasked by different people, right? And certainly in my organization, the tasking usually came from sort of the senior executive. But we would also, because Phil and I sat on all kinds of working groups, like at PCO, we would often be tasked by the Privy Council office to come in and talk about something, to prepare a document, to prepare a paper. Often we were tasked by multilateral groups that we were involved with, like the G7, G7, G8, Five Eyes, and so on. But I'll tell you a story. Sometimes it kind of vanishes into the ether. That's why I always like doing face-to-face briefings, or actually like taking my paper in and sitting down with deputy minister so-and-so.
I mean, we just had the G7. So is that something you like? If you tell a story or an example from, like, we just had this here in Canada. What would you be tasked with if you can share? Like, what would a G7 tasking be?
Well, Phil and I both sat on it was the counterterrorism something working.
Yeah.
And so that was very, very specific.
Okay.
And Phil and I sort of had developed this whole, I don't know if expertise is the right word, but maybe shtick, I don't know, but on countering violent extremism and radicalization to violence and all of that kind of stuff. So we kind of became the leads on a number of counterterrorism working group papers and projects on that subject, and those went right up to the at least sort of foreign ministry levels in the G7.
And would that be relevant to, like, threats to the G7? So you have what are the threats to an event, or what?
No, larger than that. Like, sort of, wither terrorism.
Sure.
Like, as G7 nations, what do we need to worry about? So you might get a paper, for example, on developments in the Sahel, which of course is a major thing right now, or developments in whatever. But to further your question, Andrew, about where does this go? I've got good news and I got bad news. When I was at CSE, we would produce things. So this is raw intercept that we would translate and we'd analyze. That was so critical that meetings would be delayed until our officials got the intelligence, because the intelligence would give them a leg up on whatever it is they were doing. Cool. The bad news is, and we saw this in the Hogue inquiry on Chinese interference, intelligence, and you would be very familiar with this, Andrew, intelligence that the service has been providing on Chinese interference dating back to the 1980s. We've been telling this story for a very long time, only to find out that the Prime Minister didn't read it, or if he read it, he didn't like it and got his people to try and get it changed to reflect his view of the world. And that's very frustrating for an intelligence. So you as an IO sitting in a region thinking, where's my stuff go? So imagine that the services and what goes into a product, it's not Gurski writing, I think the world is this. This is the services product. It's been vetted. The sources have been ascertained to reliability. It reflects the organization's view on something at a given moment. And then you find out that no one's bothering to read it, or if they read it, they don't like it, and they're not going to use it to implement policies or decisions. This is what really affects your morale. You're thinking, well, why have I bothered writing what I've done? If you've asked me to write this, I've written it, I've given you advice on what's happening, and you're telling me we don't like your advice because it's telling us things we don't want to hear. So that goes back to something I think we're all aware of, is a very immature intelligence culture in Canada that doesn't understand the usefulness of intelligence, and as a consequence isn't sure what to do with it once they get it.
And let me follow up with a question about, you say advice, right? And CSIS, we always say CSIS advises and government decides. And I followed the hook, and we could, that's a whole other conversation. But I want to talk about recommendations, right? And what we feel comfortable, like, what do analysts feel comfortable? Do you provide advice in terms of recommended courses of action, or simply advice in terms of, someone should deal with this or do something, or what is the line about advice and recommendations when you're writing on behalf of an organization, not Phil, like what Phil would like to see? Is, this is something I just, as you were talking, is you say, CSIS advising we have a problem and someone should do something about it, or how?
Well, Angus
I'm kind of curious myself.
Angus might have a different view on this, but from my perspective, and you're right, Andrew, advice is right in the CSIS Act. CSIS collects, analyzes, and advises. My understanding of that was that we represent the best intelligence possible at a given point. So, you've collected it, you've analyzed it, you've vetted it, you've worded it in such a way it's reflective of what everyone can agree upon. There's never 100% agreement. Different analysts see things different ways, et cetera, et cetera. But you're saying to the government, this is what we know about this. You've asked us about what is the threat to Canada from country X or actor B. This is what we know about it. To the best of my knowledge, and it may have taken place at a much higher level than you and I were ever at, about what to do about it, I was never a part of that.
Yeah.
This is what we know. This is the confidence we have in the intelligence. We don't make decisions. We're just hoping that you take into account the intelligence we provided you with to make a better decision. Unless Angus has a different experience at the RCMP, that was my understanding of advice.
Well, and that's where when the politicians say, well, CSIS didn't tell us, we should do this or that. It's like, that's not what CSIS does. They don't make recommendations. I think it's important to note in the analyst. That can be frustrating. Advisory
body.
And RCMP, would that be similar, that level of recommendation? Because would your documents be internal or external as well?
Well, a lot of the documents that I did internally would sort of, unless I was kind of going like Phil directly to PCO, Privy Council, of some partner agency, G7, Five Eyes, in which case I'd sort of be speaking for the RCMP. But internally in the RCMP, because I used to brief up to sort of the executive level, after a while, the culture sort of shifted as the RCMP started to realize, oh, you know what, this there's actually value in this, and we started being asked for recommendations, or at least some of us started being asked for recommendations. And I mean, I used to have a boss, and I'd go in and I probably the best boss I ever had, and I would say to him, okay, this is what's going on, yada yada yada, about whatever the situation was, and he'd say, all right, give me options. He says, I want 3 options. No, I want 4 options. Yeah. And you'd have to be ready with that. You'd have to be ready to give him options. And so so there was very much internally, there was very much an advisory role that intelligence analysts played, often because we knew far more about a subject because we'd been so immersed in it than most of the other people in the organization.
I guess that does make sense if it's an internal focus versus sending notes out. I would say, sorry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, just very quickly. I would say there was one time in my career where I got the sense that it was actually a little bit more than advice, but recommendations, and that was when the Americans decided to go into Iraq in 2003. And I was asked to from a service perspective, what do we know about Saddam Hussein's relationship with Al Qaeda? Because of course that was one of the two bases upon which the Americans decided it was weapons of mass destruction and it was Al Qaeda. And I remember writing, we have very little intelligence, we have nothing corroborated that there's a close relationship between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and this is what the intelligence says. Now, in the end, the Croatian government decided not to follow the American lead and go into Iraq 2003. I'm not claiming any responsibility, or it wasn't because Gurski said it's all my fault, or it was me. But that was one of the rare occasions where we were asked at the most senior level, we need to know now, do you support the American conclusion that there is a working relationship between Al Qaeda and Iraq? And we said we do not support that conclusion based on what we know.
Interesting, really interesting stuff, guys. I'm very aware that we have a premier, Iranian specialist here, and with all that's going on in the world, and I have a question I was going to ask about kind of challenges you dealt with and challenges that you see now. And so I want to ask you about the challenges you see now as analysts and what's going on in the world. And I'm also curious if do you notice, are there trend lines? Are we going in a direction? Are they the same threats that were there that they're always there, but we get distracted and we think we focus on terrorism, we forget about foreign interference, but really foreign interference is there all along? Or do you see trends, and what are your thoughts about the current challenges or threats you see right now?
I think people have short working memories, and again, Angus and I started during the Cold War, and I recall very distinctly at CSE, once the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, and it's over. The end
of history, right?
Yeah, we let go of all of our Russian linguists. We said, thank you for your service to the Queen and country. We don't need you anymore because the war is over. And look, 30 years later with what's happening, I would say the same thing on terrorism. In the past 10 years, the government, rightly or wrongly, has decided that Islamist extremism is no longer a priority. It's all about incels and far right and everything else. And I keep saying the data doesn't say that. The data shows quite concretely that jihadis are still responsible for somewhere north of 99.9% of all terrorist acts. And that's not me saying that. These are studies that are independent of mine. So I think, in answer to your question, Andrew, you're always asked to do more things than you have resources to do them. That's the problem. Yeah. So how do you prioritize? As the service, you've got the 4 mandates under Section 2. Where do you put your priorities? Do you put them more on foreign interference now because of what's happened because of the Hogue inquiry? Do you put them more on espionage or theft of technology because of the Winnipeg lab incident? Do you put them more on, and if you're terrorism, do you take them away from jihadis and put them on the far right? Do you put them on the far left? Do you put them on Sikh terrorism? I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think that, these organizations are limited. The way I put it is that you have infinite requirements based on finite resources. And it becomes a challenge as to how do you allocate those resources.
But even the questions you're asking your analysts, I thought, Phil, you're saying, does the intelligence corroborate that, it's Iraq's ties to Al-Qaeda now, or does the intelligence corroborate that Iran is hours away, days away from nuclear capacity? Right? We're kind of asking the same question, different scenarios, obviously. Yeah. Angus, sorry, I don't want to get in your way, but what are you seeing from your career and what you think are the threats now? Has there been a line? Is it up and down? Does it change?
Well, I mean, I think there are the threats that we always have with us, as Phil alluded to, and I think what I see are in terms of some of the emerging threats. I mean, I made sort of a slightly facetious comment about AI a few minutes ago, but I think that AI is going to completely change sort of how AI we've reached an existential moment as a species with AI, and I think it's going to completely change how we think, how we interact with the world, and it's certainly going to change the craft of intelligence, as I said earlier. And I mean, I think that the whole, and a lot of this actually is related to AI or will become related to AI. I mean, I can't emphasize enough sort of the whole problem of foreign interference, and I don't think that we've dealt with it particularly well up to this point. And I also continue to believe that political violence is a very, very serious problem. And I think that sort of new manifestations of political violence, and certainly the three of us have kind of worked together on some of this stuff. Some of the new manifestations of political violence are extremely worrisome. And many of them are exactly the same manifestations of political violence that we were dealing with 20 years ago. They've just kind of sort of transmogrified into something new.
The great Calvin
and I think this is, probably, I mean, we could probably, between the three of us, we could sit here and we could talk for the rest of the afternoon about, threats, emerging threats, what we have to worry about. But I think, whether you're a senior government official, or whether you're the CEO of a corporation, or even if you're running trying to run some kind of a small business. I mean, this speaks to the importance of what the three of us did for a living. This speaks to the importance of intelligence, and intelligence as a means of kind of understanding and interpreting the world and kind of shining a light on your way through that world.
Yeah. Well, one quick addition, Andrew, I would add to what Angus said, I agree with him completely, is disinformation and misinformation. Yes. We all know this as intelligence, right? Your analysis is only as good as the veracity of your raw information. And we're in an era now where people don't have the skill sets to differentiate between crap and good stuff. Yeah. And this is very, very worrisome. I advise people, when you read something, read it as if you're an intelligence analyst. Who's the source? Yeah. Why is the source saying this? Is it because it's true or because they want to influence? What is the credibility of the source? Where are they getting their information from? And I think that, we live in an information gold. We should be the smartest we've ever been as a species right now, given the access. I mean, Angus and I remember, we used to have to read paper copies of the Globe Mail because that's all existed back in the early 80s. Yeah. Everything's online now, which is wonderful for me as a retired guy. Now I have access to stuff online. The problem is 99% of it is absolute crap. And then how do you wade through that crap to get to the golden nuggets that are actually going to help you make good analysis?
Well, I used to think, when I was there, that the challenge was collecting the information, like finding the golden nugget. Now I think there's so much information in the world. The real value add is making sense of it, right? Yeah, exactly. There's so much information about every person, about our contacts, our movements, our affiliations, our, everything, every thought we ever had is on Twitter, and I think about our BRS reports, right? It was a document repository.
Yes.
Right. It was not nowadays, the fanciest we had with I2 link charts. Yeah. Right. And now the role of analysis and the analyst is so important for all the reasons you said, both of you said. There's so much information. We don't know what information is good and what's not. And the value is, what does it mean? What does it mean for you and for others? So I want to give you some final thoughts as we wrap up. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll do this again. Now we figured out the technology. We're good to go.
I always used to say when I was teaching, I was kind of being a bit of an iconoclast, but I used to tell people, and this was in the days, when we were really focused on kind of, we got to get all the information and we got to, have the systems to deal with it and so on, which is, to a very large extent what we're dealing with today. But I used to tell analysts who were feeling overwhelmed that it's a lot better to do really good analysis on an incomplete data set than it is to do shitty analysis on the complete set of all the data that's out there. So
yeah, if I could just one last comment.
Yes.
First of all, Andrew, thank you very much for the opportunity for Angus and myself to talk about something that is very near and dear to our hearts and still is. At the end of the day, you've got to be open to the facts. As I said earlier, you have to constantly learn. Some things are the same, but some things are very different. And if you want to work as an intelligence analyst, especially on a tactical side, we have talked a lot about tactical because Angus and I were strategic, but tactical analysts can move from task to task, just like IOs could, from task to task to task. And you got to pick up things rather quickly. So you have to have that drive and the energy to want to learn. So if all of a sudden we want you to report on Russian organized crime, which I know Angus did work on at one point, I'd have to start from scratch. Who do I go to? Well, I go to Angus first. But who are the sources I would go to learn about the basics of Russian organized crime in order to be able to do analysis that's meaningful to my customers, kind of thing. So it's having the humility to know. Yeah, I know a lot, but there's lots of things I don't know. But again, I don't know, but I'm going to find out for you.
Yeah, I always say in security. What's that, Angus? Sorry.
That's the operative word, humility.
Yes, I always say in security, we never know when we're right. We always know when we're wrong, right? We never know when we're right, and so you have to constantly be challenging your hypothesis. Yeah. You have to be humble in your analysis, and you have to really, keep kind of going back and saying, am I right? What do we know? What do we not know? Because you'll only know when you're wrong. So look, we've also come together to do what we call the Canadian Intelligence Brief. I would be remiss if I didn't plug it, and I appreciate your contributions. We are trying to provide a Canadian intelligence product to folks with responsibility for Canadian assets, including information and people, right? I think that's important. In Canada, we have a lot of intelligence, but not always focused on Canadians. And what does this mean for Canada? So what for Canada? So check out our CIB on the website. Phil, you'll be happy. Angus, I don't know if you'd see this. I would say I borrowed some swag when I left. I got this from the CSIS gift shop, and I'm giving this away to a subscriber to the CIB. Because you know what? I have a bunch of these.
CSIS swag. I got a box full, I think, Andrew. So.
I got mugs. I got golf balls. The thing with the golf balls is if you lose them and someone says, "Is this yours?" You can't say it was yours. Right? You had, I never saw that CSIS golf ball in my life. But we're giving away the hat to subscribers to the CIB, and it's coming every 2 weeks. And Angus and Phil, we're so happy to have you as contributors because, thank you for your service and continued service. And this was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I hope. And Phil's got a podcast. Plug your podcast as well.
Yeah,
there's some other colleagues.
Yeah, so I've got a couple podcasts. One is called Canadian Intelligence A, or CIA for short. Blame my sister-in-law for the title, but I didn't pick it. Right. The other one is one I do with two former IOs, intelligence officers, called Spies Like Us. It's much more irreverent. It's three guys in a virtual bar talking about national security issues. So it's fun, but it's also serious. But I also want to say, for the listeners and the watchers, when Angus and I finished our careers together at public safety, they used to call us the two old wise men because we had 60 years of experience amongst us. We were working with people who were barely out of diapers, I think, Angus, at the time. Right. So I'm not sure if we were the two old wise men or the two old wise guys. Maybe it was a combination of the two.
That's right. That's distinction's been lost over time.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's great. And I listen to podcast. Obviously, I know the folks you do it with. It's a lot of fun. We need more people talking about national security in Canada. We need more views. Insights. I don't know barely anything, and so I appreciate your contributions and stay tuned. And that's just one of those things that I do for that reason. So thank you very much, Phil, for joining Angus as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Always good to see you.
We'll do it again.
All right.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. And we'll
guys.
post this on YouTube if you missed it or want to see it again.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Take care all.